Everyone, here we are all the way up to day 14. All right, so hopefully yesterday you completed the exam. You all have that into me. In real time, I am busily grading those exams. In virtual time, I am here talking about the goals of monetary policy. Right, so today's lecture is really going to be mainly on chapter 16 of Michigan, but I'm also going to be working in some of chapter 22 of Michigan. And what's in chapter 22 is really largely a review of principles of macro, right? Some of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which I hope you have some memory of. I'm going to be giving you a very quick review of some of that material, but for those of you who this is a little bit rustier for, you might want to go back and look through some of your old notes, or maybe take a little bit more detail looking through chapter 22 of Michigan. Okay, so anyway, as I said, the big topic of today is to talk about the goals of monetary policy. So switching to our notes here. Oops. Here we are. Sorry, don't have this set up. Okay, the goals of monetary policy. So yesterday we talked about how the Fed thinks about monetary policy, and they think about it through this kind of flow chart of tools, targets, and goals. The Fed has tools that they directly control, targets that they indirectly control, and then goals that they want to try to achieve but don't have very good control over. All right. So the tools that we've talked about are primarily open market operations and discount lending and required reserve ratio. And you notice here I have a little asterisk on open market operations to denote the fact that the open market operations are the primary tool that the Federal Reserve uses, right? Of course, the Fed has other tools that they could use, like buying other sorts of assets, or we talked yesterday about the Fed using forward guidance. I don't know to what extent these are important tools, though, right? So basically, the Fed has three important tools. They primarily use open market operation. To this, then, they could try to achieve some targets. What could be some targets the Fed could try to achieve? Well, target interest rates, particularly the federal funds rate, which is, once again, there's an asterisk here denoting that this is the target the Fed typically follows. Or targeting the money supply, right? And we'll talk about why the Fed chooses to focus on interest rates and not the money supply a little bit later. And then eventually it's to hit these goals, right? And goals could be many things. It could be high output, it could be low inflation, it could be low unemployment, it could be focusing on the exchange rate, or it could be financial stability. Typically, the Fed focuses on the first two, output and inflation, right? But we will talk about the others. And these are also goals of monetary policy, but they're not the primary goals of monetary policy for reasons we're going to talk about. So once again, let me remind you of the analogy that I used yesterday about playing golf and playing a par 5 hole, right? You don't just stand on the tee and look out at the flag and be like, I'm hitting the ball right at that flag, right? You have to kind of work backwards, right? So if I want to get the ball in the hole in 5 shots, where exactly do I have to hit my first shot to set me up to do that, right? So that's my target, right? If my goal is to get the ball in the hole, my target for the first shot might be, well, I want to put it on the left side of the fairway. And then I have to think about the tool that gets me there. And the tool would be, what's the club I'm going to use, and maybe some of the mechanics of my swing, right? And so that's really how the Fed thinks about monetary policy as well. They have goals, but they're far out there, right? And they're not very easy to achieve. And so to get to those goals, the Fed has to pick a target that's more achievable, and then they have to pick the tools and use the tools in a way that they think will help them get there. So let's go back and remind ourselves, what's the relationship between money and output and inflation? We've talked about this many times in this class, but we haven't really used a model, right? I've kind of appealed to your memory of intermediate macro, but let's be a little bit more specific here. and reminding ourselves about what we learned in macro. I'm sorry, not intermediate, intro macro. What we learned in intro macro about the relationship between money and inflation and output. And so if you remember in intro macro, we talked about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, which is the relationship between the aggregate price level, the aggregate price level and real GDP. And if you remember what we talked about is that in the long run, what determines the level of your potential output? Well, potential output is really determined by your productive capacity, which is a function of three things. It's a function of how much physical capital you have, how much human capital you have, and how much technology you have, right? So basically, human capital, physical capital, technology determines your potential output. But in the short run, it's more complicated than that, because in the short run, we can be above potential output or below potential output because of changes in aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply are based on short-run fluctuations in the demand for goods and short-run fluctuations in the supply of goods. So while there's a potential level of output, right, and that potential level of output would be kind of when we're fully employing all of the resources to our economy, it is possible for us to be above or below that, right? And so output can be too high. And notice here, if output is too high, that's going to begin to affect the price level in ways we're going to talk about here in a moment. Or if output's too low, that also impacts the price level. When output is too low, we call that a recession. And if output is higher than potential output, we would call that an expansion, right? And so one of the things that any policymaker wants to do is to use monetary and fiscal policy to try to keep output here around potential output. But we don't want it to be too high or too low, right? We kind of want a Goldilocks economy. The Goldilocks economy is an economy in which, right, it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right, right? So that's really kind of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, or the way that we conceptualize how the Fed has to think about monetary policy. So how then does monetary policy impact the economy? Well, it does that primarily through shifting aggregate demand. If we think about this graph back here, the Fed has the power to increase aggregate demand in this direction, right? Shift it to the right and drive output up and inflation up, or they could reduce aggregate demand and drive output down and inflation down. So there is this trade-off that we're going to talk about many times this morning about inflation and output. The Fed can drive up output, but they're also going to drive up inflation. Let me back up here. Why is it that the Fed shifts aggregate demand? How exactly does this work? And there's really many ways, and we've talked about most of these ways before in class about how monetary policy impacts the aggregate economy and how it impacts aggregate demand. The first way that monetary policy impacts aggregate demand that we've talked about the most is through changing interest rates, right? We could call this the interest rate channel of monetary policy. When the Fed increases the money supply by conducting open market purchase, we know that lowers interest rates and that encourages investment and other spending. And higher spending increases aggregate demand, right? Moves aggregate demand to the right. So when the Fed conducts an open market purchase and increases the money supply, aggregate demand moves to the right. What's that going to do in the short run? Put upward pressure on inflation, upward pressure on output. Or what happens when the Fed decreases the money supply? That's going to raise interest rates, lower spending, lower investment, and move aggregate demand to the left. That's going to put downward pressure on inflation and output. That's the primary channel by which monetary policy works, but we've also talked about, or we'll talk about, other ways in which monetary policy works. One of the ways that monetary policy impacts the economy is through the stock market, right? We've talked about how when the Fed increases the money supply and cuts interest rates, that puts upward pressure on stock prices, right? We talked about this all the way back in chapter 7. And so what happens when stock prices go up? People are wealthier, they might spend more, and that might increase aggregate demand as well. So that's another way that monetary policy works, not just directly through interest rates, but indirectly through the stock market. Monetary policy might also just work indirectly through people's balance sheets by putting upward pressure on other assets prices, right? So not just drive up stock prices, but other asset prices like housing prices, right? When the Fed increases the money supply and cuts interest rates, housing prices go up, and that's a big function of people's wealth. So once again, when wealth goes up, aggregate demand goes up. We haven't talked about this much. Actually, we haven't talked about this at all. We will talk about this more tomorrow and in the next couple of days going forward. But monetary policy also impacts exchange rates. And so if this is a little unclear to you now, we'll try to fill in the blanks here going in the next couple of days. But when the Fed raises the money supply and cuts interest rates, this also puts downward pressure on the exchange rate. And lower exchange rates encourage exports and they discourage imports, which tends to drive up our trade balance and also tends to stimulate aggregate demand. So this is another channel by which monetary policy can stimulate aggregate demand. If the Fed increases the money supply and cuts interest rates, our net exports go up and aggregate demand goes up. And then there's also the risk channel that when the Fed provides a lot more liquidity and increases the money supply, it also tends to reduce risk, right? This lender of last resort effect. So which one of these are right? They all are, right? These are not mutually exclusive, right? When the Fed conducts a change in policy, it's really impacting the economy in many different ways. But we can all agree that when the Fed increases the money supply and cuts interest rates, that's increasing aggregate demand. And when the Fed's raising interest rates and cutting the money supply, that's cutting aggregate demand. So how is monetary policy supposed to work in theory? Well, according to Keynesian economics, right, how the central bank should be working is they should be leaning against the wind, meaning whatever the momentum in the economy is, the Fed should be trying to do the opposite of that, right? The Fed should be trying to do the opposite of that. So let's think about an example of a recession. A recession is when output has fallen below potential output. So here's our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. The yellow line is potential output. We have short run aggregate supply and long run, short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Let's say that for whatever reason, aggregate demand falls. For instance, a pandemic, right? That makes it very difficult for people to spend money, right? And to do the things that they like to do. So aggregate demand falls and we move from point E2 to E1, right? Now output is below potential output. What should the Federal Reserve be trying to do? The Federal Reserve in this case, when the economy slows down, should be trying to stimulate the economy and moving it back from E1 to E2. How should they do that? By open market purchases and cutting interest rates, right? Open market purchases and cutting interest rates. When the economy slows down, the Fed should be trying to speed it up. However, what happens if the economy begins to grow too fast, right? As I said, we want a kind of Goldilocks economy here. We don't want the economy to get too fast either, because notice here, what happens if aggregate demand then goes way up so that output is above potential output, right? So now here we have a situation where demand has gotten way, way up here, and we're at point E1, where output is greater than potential output, and look what's happened to the prices. They begin to go up. What should the Fed be doing now? Well, the Fed should now be conducting open market sales and raising interest rates to reduce aggregate demand. Why are we doing that? Because we don't want this buildup of inflation, right? We don't want the economy to grow too slow, but we also don't want it to grow too fast, because that's going to help keep inflation under control. So that's what we mean by leaning against the wind. When the economy slows down, the Fed speeds it up. When the economy speeds up, the Fed slows it down, right? And really what the Fed is trying to balance here is the short run, the effect of short run output versus long run inflation. Yes, in the short run, the Fed really wants the economy to be doing well, right? We want output to be high. But the Fed also has to keep its eye on inflation. And if the Fed puts too much emphasis on output, then inflation could get out of control. Where do excuse me? Where do we think the Fed is today? Well, this is very clear. The Fed today is all about output, right? In the middle of this pandemic, when unemployment is predicted to maybe spike up to 20%, to maybe GDP fall by 10%, the Fed is all about output, right? And you can see this if you look at the Federal Open Market Committee's last statement. This is one of the more unusual statements that you'll ever see from the Federal Open Market Committee. Usually these statements have a pretty standard format, but the one that was released in March 23rd, which is the last time the Federal Open Market Committee met, just looks much different, in part because usually in these statements, you'll see the Fed talk about both output and inflation. In this statement, they almost only talk about output and what they're trying to do to stimulate output. So let's just look through this really quickly here. So this is the press release from March 23rd, right? So this was, over a month ago. The Federal Reserve is committed to use its full range of tools to support the U.S. economy in this challenging time and thereby promote its maximum employment and price stability, right? So those are the two things, output, right? Output and employment and prices. Federal Open Market Committee is taking further action to support the flow of credit to households and businesses. The Federal Reserve will continue to purchase Treasury securities and agency mortgage-backed securities in the amounts needed to support smooth market functioning. So the Fed is saying, we're buying bonds, right? We're buying to try to increase liquidity. I'm not going to read through all of this, but the Fed then talks about other things. In a related set of actions, the Fed announced additional measures to support the flow of credit in the households and businesses. In connection with these plans, the committee voted unanimously to authorize direct the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, until otherwise instructed, to execute transactions in the system open market account in accordance with the following directive, right? And basically this directive says that the open market desk in New York can be buying and selling up to $30 billion of bonds a day, right? That is a huge number. And so, really what the Fed is saying is that we are going all in with open market operations, and we're also buying other assets as needed to promote market liquidity. So, I realize it's a little hard to get some context for this open market statement if you haven't been reading them for years or months preceding this. But yeah, clearly the message the Fed is sending is we are all in and trying to stimulate the economy. We are going to do whatever we can, and we're going to try things that we tried in 2008, like, buy huge portions of bonds, buy mortgage-backed securities and other backed securities. But we're also thinking about other things, right? And so the Fed is all in on this leaning against the wind. Why? Because inflation doesn't appear to be nearly the issue that output is right now, and that's not too surprising. Okay, so let's be back here in a moment. I want to talk a little bit more about this trade-off between inflation and output.